Welcome to Trib Talk. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pearce with the Salt Lake Tribune. The federal government owns about 67% of the land within Utah's borders, a fact that rankles those who don't want a big government regulating grazing, mining, and other activities on public land. Tensions between locals and federal officials are flaring again throughout the West, from Iron County to the high-profile Cliven Bundy case in Nevada. And today, we're talking about the recent unrest and the options for moving forward. Joining me on the Google Hangout today is Representative Ken Ivory. He's a Republican of West Jordan and president of the American Lands Council, which advocates state ownership of federal public lands, and he's joining us from his office in South Jordan. And Representative, great to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks to be with you. Good to be with you.
Also with us, Morgan Lyon-Cotty. She is local program manager at the Hinckley Institute of Politics, and she's here in the newsroom with us. Dr. Cotty, thank you so much for your time as well.
Thank you.
And Thomas Burr is the Tribune's Washington correspondent, joining us from his office in the nation's capital. Tommy, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
Pat Shea is going to be joining us shortly, and I'll introduce him when he arrives. You are invited to join our conversation today. Should public lands stay under federal control, or do you think the states would do a better job? If you've got questions or comments to share, you can send them along to the hashtag Trib Talk on Twitter and Google+. You can put them in the comments section right here at sltrib.com, or you can send us a text, and that number is 801-609-8059. Tommy, I'll start with you. There have been several recent flashpoints when it comes to the feds versus locals. Maybe you can recap just briefly what's happening in Nevada, in Iron County, what's coming up in San Juan County?
Sure. This is kind of a classic case of the Wild Wild West, something that I don't think a lot of my colleagues here in Washington really understand. But let's start with Nevada. Cliven Bundy, whose family has been ranching in Nevada since like the 1940s, he claims on his mother's side, people who ranched there into the 1800s. He has his cattle on this allotment. His permit for that cattle to graze on public lands was rescinded in 1993. There's been a couple court battles over this. Two court orders now have ordered the BLM to essentially round up his cattle and sell them at auction to pay back the more than $1 million he owes in fines and fees for that 20-year point at which he has defied the court orders. It's one of those situations that is not going to turn out well. The BLM goes in heavily armed. It makes a lot of people angry. Kind of an armed militia shows up. Literally guys in cowboy hats, riding horses with guns. Some people aiming their guns at federal authorities. The federal authorities aiming right back. And it really was a kind of a scary tinderbox for a while. The BLM eventually pulled back and is going to try to figure out another route because they didn't want any kind of shooting to happen between two sets of Americans. But there are echoes of this, what we would call in some ways the Sagebrush Rebellion that started in the 70s or 80s. In Iron County, the county commissioners are saying that there are 4 times as many wild horses in the county, and the BLM needs to come and round them up, or the county citizens are going to start doing that. In San Juan County, a commissioner is trying to start a rally to drive ATVs into an area that currently is off limits while the BLM decides whether it's going to allow ATVs in that area. These are all kind of flashpoints that we've seen over and over in the West over the issue of public lands.
Dr. Cotty, Tommy mentioned the Sagebrush Rebellion. Maybe you can put this into some historical context for us. What was the Sagebrush Rebellion? And these tensions are nothing new in the nation at large, but particularly here in the West.
Right. This is not a new issue for us at all. There was movements even back in the 1950s and 1920s to try to move the federal lands into state control. But the original Sagebrush Rebellion in the 1970s, really the flashpoint for that was some legislation that passed through Congress in 1976 that people in the West just felt was environmental extremists trying to take too much control of the land. And this really reached a really high point as people, as Carter's approval ratings just sunk lower and lower. And a lot of states in the West banded together to try to take control of those federal lands. Nevada even passed a law to take control, but the Supreme Court actually found it unconstitutional. Utah passed a law as well, and Governor Matheson said he would sign it if they would include some safeguards for the environment. With the Supreme Court case, the law ended up sort of being a dead letter. But it is interesting that a lot of those same concerns are arising again, and it's really multifaceted. It's east-west, it's state control, federal control, environmentalists versus those who want to be able to have greater access to the land. So it's a very complicated and long-standing issue.
Do you see any differences between the Sagebrush Rebellion of 30, 40 years ago and what we're seeing today?
There seems to be, there are some similarities. There are states like Utah that are trying to pass through legislation. There's talks of lawsuits. There's a lot of similarities. As I was thinking a little bit more about this today, I was trying to think about what really spurred this latest Sagebrush Rebellion, especially in Utah. And I don't think you can ignore the coincidence that the Tea Party movement and the Sagebrush Rebellion have come around at a pretty similar time. The Utah Foundation and Hinckley Institute did a survey of state Republican delegates, of all delegates, at the last conventions in 2010 and 2012. And interestingly, those state Republican delegates thought states' rights was the most important issue, and control of federal lands was the fourth most important issue for them. So they have so much control over who ends up being in elected office. I don't think you can overlook the fact that those delegates think that's so important, and now we have elected officials who are acting on that.
Representative Ivory, you are one of those officials who believes that states need to assert power over the land that's in their state borders. I understand several dozen lawmakers met in Salt Lake City last week to say it really is time for states to intervene. And you're a leader in this movement. Why? Why do you think that states are better suited to manage the nation's public lands?
Well, Jennifer, there's a lot of things to pick up on what Morgan said. Nevada, that issue never went to the Supreme Court. The case was mooted in the Ninth Circuit, so that's never been dealt with as any kind of precedent. The way this started, I'm not a cowboy.
Excuse me, slip of the tongue, Representative.
Excuse me?
Excuse me, I cited the wrong court. Thank you.
Yeah, it was Nevada District Court, and the case was mooted in the Ninth Circuit because the issue went away. So people like to throw those things out. There is no case that has ever been presented to the Supreme Court asking the question, does the federal government need to honor the very same compact of statehood with Utah that it kept with all states east of Colorado? North and South Dakota, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Nebraska, Oklahoma, they have the exact same operative language in their statehood agreements. And so how this really came about, again, I'm not a cowboy. I live in West Jordan, as you mentioned. We have a $2.5 billion a year education funding gap. We're $2.5 billion below average in per pupil funding. We have 32% of our revenue in the state comes from a federal government that in its own financial statements says it's unsustainably broke. And we have no backup plan. There's no way you're ever going to tax your way out of that hole. So what we started looking at was, we know we have trillions of dollars in resources locked up in the federally controlled lands. In fact, we found out that it's $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the federally controlled lands throughout the West. Government Accountability Office, a year and a half ago testifying to Congress, said there's more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming than the rest of the world combined. And environmentally, the urgency is also very apparent. Governor Bullock, Democrat governor from Montana, last year at the Western Governors Association, talked about this urgency that millions of acres, tens of millions of acres, are being devastated by beetle devastation, the fires ravaging through the federal forests, killing millions of animals, destroying the watershed, and destroying habitat for decades. And so that's a very different framework than some cowboys in the early 80s getting together and being upset about the Federal Land Policy Management Act. This is about the only solution big enough to fund education, to better care for the environment, and grow economies locally and nationally.
So if I understand you correctly, this is a financial, economic question, not a states' rights question?
Well, Jennifer, they go together, right? Think about that. 32% of our state revenue, the single largest line item of our revenue in our budget, comes from a federal government that is broke. Erskine Bowles, the former Clinton White House chief of staff, said these debts, these deficits, they're like a cancer, and they're going to destroy this nation from within. So we need to have some way we're going to be responsible for caring for our children, sick and poor people, roads and public safety, no matter what happens in Washington. And so if Washington simply honors the same compact at statehood with Utah, and we manage our own public lands for multiple use, sustained yield with local planning, having access to the resource while also managing those public lands within our state. Nevada just came out with a study that states managing public land generates substantial positive net revenue, while the federal government managing public lands lose money for every acre that they manage. And so we can't afford not to.
Speaking with Utah Representative Ken Ivory, also with us Thomas Burr, and Dr. Morgan Lyon-Cotti from the Hinckley Institute of Politics. We're talking about who should be the caretakers of public lands, the feds or the states. Joining us also now is Pat Shea. He's a former BLM director and an attorney in private practice. And Pat, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Sorry for being late.
That's okay. We've been sort of recapping the history, going over the similarities and differences between current unrest and the Sagebrush Rebellion of the 1970s. As a former BLM director, what's your take on the current situation, particularly in southern Utah and in Nevada? I mean, and what do you think is wrong with states managing public lands?
I don't think states are capable of the complexity of managing these lands, and I think people like Representative Ivory get off on these rhetorical pitches that don't have a historical basis, and they certainly don't have a scientific basis. The people of the United States have paid for these properties for more than 150 years, and now for somebody in the first part of the 21st century to come in and say, oh, by the way, we want these lands for our own purposes, doesn't quite work that way. So I think it's a very dangerous situation in Nevada. I worry a great deal about public servants who are being made fun of when they're doing an extremely dangerous job, and they're protecting the public lands which you and I and every citizen of Utah and other states in the Union are the beneficiaries of.
Here's a tweet coming in from a real name. Does Mr. Ivory support Mr. Bundy and his supporters? Representative, do you want to weigh in on the situation in Nevada?
Yeah, you know, this is so much bigger than one rancher in Nevada. When you have what's happening in Iron County, you've got their ecosystem is being destroyed, where the BLM's own resource management plan authorizes 300 wild horses, and they have thousands that are multiplying every 4 to 5 years. Throughout the forest, you have communities in Oregon that used to be the best funded school districts in the nation. They're now boarded up, and they've gone from 29 sheriff deputies down to 3. They can't even respond to calls because they have no revenue. Their renewable resource has been turned into a liability that's now being managed for maximum combustion. Going back to what Pat Shea, excuse me, let me just finish. Going back to what Pat Shea was saying on a historical precedent, most people don't realize that Illinois was 90% federally controlled for decades. Missouri, Louisiana, Alabama, and of course, you know, that great western state of Florida. They used to complain we can't educate our kids because you're not disposing of our land and keeping your statehood promise. Those states got together and compelled Congress to honor the same operative language that's in our statehood agreement to transfer the public lands. There is, in fact, a very direct historical precedence on this, and you don't change these solemn compacts of statehood, the Supreme Court said unanimously in 2009, by a unilateral policy of Congress.
Could we stop the rhetoric for just a second, Ken, and talk about reality? The situation in Iron County is not as you describe, because there are pens there that those horses will be taken to. The problem that is created is you and others like you inflame local elected officials rather than cooperating with public federal officials to say, oh, we're going to be defiant, we're going to take this back. I'd like to challenge you to a debate at the Hinckley Institute to talk about state rights versus federal rights and have a time limitation, not as you do on the legislative floor, but as you would have an exchange as our founding fathers did in terms of an open public debate. Do you accept that challenge?
I'd be happy to do that, Pat.
Okay, so this is not a debate, though. This is a discussion, and I'm going to be the moderator. So I will direct the questions, and I appreciate your cooperation in that. An email coming from Moab Mike. We're supposed to be a land of law. Local dictation of federal and land issues was long ago resolved. Is that the case, Dr. Cotty? I mean, is this rehashing something that has already been resolved?
You know, Representative Ivory has brought up the legalese a couple of times, and it is interesting. I think what he's referring to is what we talk about as the equal footing doctrine, that all of the states should be brought into the union with equal footing. And he is right. There are states that had large percentages that were controlled by the federal government that are now in private control. If you look at what percentage of a state is arid or semi-arid, that goes really close, almost hand in hand, with how much the federal government still controls. The federal government went through almost 100 years of basically trying to give away land with the Homestead Act and trying to encourage people to settle the West, and that changed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And because settlers in Utah hadn't settled these arid lands because they weren't farmable, that is, really the explanation for why that land is still under federal control. If the comment, and I'm wondering, is actually about whether we should be law-abiding with how we take control of the federal land if the state chooses to do that. I have really appreciated some of the comments by Utah's elected leaders over the past week with this Bundy case, just reaffirming that there are legal ways to go about this. Both sides, interestingly enough, think that they can go back to Utah's charter and argue for why the government should either give us the land or for why the federal government has absolute right to that land. But that there are the legal ways to do that through the legislature and through the courts.
I should mention that Representative Ivory is advocating resolving some of the issues through federal legislation. It's something called the Transfer Public Land Act. But back to our earlier tweet question, Representative, I didn't get a good sense. Do you support the Bundy's action as civil disobedience?
Well, think about that for a second, Jennifer. If you're building a house and you've got a bad foundation, it doesn't matter if you get down the road, you want to try to decide was the framer or the electrician or the plumber at fault for a bad house. You've got a bad foundation. Nevada's Enabling Act was 3 weeks apart from Nebraska's. Word for word the same on the disposal of public lands. The federal government disposed from more than 30% public land down to 1 in Nebraska. They went from 86 to 81. So the federal government has not honored the solemn compact of statehood. Going back to Morgan's point, where we're a nation of laws, the Supreme Court has said repeatedly that these enabling acts are solemn compacts with enforceable rights and obligations on both sides. And so if we are going to act as a nation of laws, the federal government needs to uphold its side of that as well. This idea that we simply change that policy and that solemn compact because the land is arid, there's no arid clause in the Constitution. In fact, Governor Dern, George Dern, a Democrat in the late 20s, early 30s, said, no, you have to give us all the land. There was a proposal to give the states just the surface. In fact, there were hearings on granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. And Governor Dern, I have his quote right here, he says, if everything is taken out of it that is worth anything, all we're left is nothing but the skin of a squeezed lemon. We cannot get immediate control and rehabilitation of our public domain. If we can't get that, then we're against this whole proposal. They proposed a bill to just give the surface to the states, and the states banded together and said, no, you have to keep the whole promise. And so this idea that the land is arid, I mean, think about Oregon and Washington and Alaska. They have more precipitation than any of the states, and yet we hear this over and over again. The land is arid, therefore the federal government somehow keeps it.
Jennifer, there's a chance to talk here. I do think Governor Babbitt in Arizona showed what can happen when you have good cooperation. And Governor Matheson actually in 1976 attempted to do this with Project Bold. And instead of getting caught up in long rhetoric speeches, he was simply trying, as Governor Babbitt successfully did, to separate the crazy mosaic lands that we have of school trust lands and public lands and put them into manageable units. And that's going to be a much more functional, much more cost-efficient way of getting our lands to be more productive than saying, I'm in charge and therefore I get to do it. We are a consensus government. We're a representative government. And fortunately for the rest of the United States, people like Representative Ivory doesn't represent them.
I want to get some more comments. Old Walton writes, states running the federal lands is a mistake, in my opinion. They would be swallowed up by greedy political figures that have sticky fingers and fat wallets. Larry in the comment section says, you liberals make me laugh. I can tell you from experience there are no better stewards of the land than the ranchers that use them. It's their livelihood. The BLM is run by Easterners who have no idea how to manage Western lands. I guess, Pat Shea, your response?
Well, Neil Cornsey is from Elko, Nevada. I'm from Salt Lake and was from Wyoming. Each of the people who I know in BLM have lived in the West most of their life. They don't like actually working in Washington, D.C. because they like being out on the land. So I think that's misinformation. But I do think what we need to do, Ken, is think scientifically about how some of these practices can be sustained. And I certainly have seen good grazing, and I think most public ranchers, that is, ranchers who use public lands, do an extremely good job. But it's a few like Mr. Bundy, and I still don't think you've answered Jennifer's question. Do you support Mr. Bundy and his tactics?
Do I support his tactics? Mr. Bundy's been put in an untenable situation that if the federal government honors the same promise of statehood, Pat, never happens. You want to call the federal government honoring the solemn compact of statehood rhetoric. I call that rule of law, where the representatives of the excuse me, Pat, let me finish your question. Where the representatives of the people stand up, the constitutional actors, and the Supreme Court 2 years ago, Pat, said states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. The independent power of the state serves as a check on the arbitrary power of the federal government. That's the Supreme Court 2 years ago. We're working to do that through the legal constitutional mechanisms, and the fact that Cliven Bundy's been put in this untenable situation, and now you've got the federal government in a purely civil matter acting in the most egregious, uncivilized manner.
Do you support him or do you not?
This has become.
Do you support him or do you not?
I support the federal government honoring the compact of statehood, and then Cliven Bundy's issue goes away.
Okay, let's move on. Tommy Burr, what's the view from Washington on all this? I know you recently interviewed some Interior officials. What do they make of it?
Well, I guess as an Easterner who is from Utah, I have a good perspective on this one. I talked to yesterday the most recent BLM director, Bob Abbey, about this, and he had a valid point about this. It's not just about public lands here. People are angry all over the United States about different things. They're angry about health care or unemployment or federal spending or the lack of government help in some areas. A poll recently last fall, I believe, showed from the Pew Research Center, showed 50% of Republicans who aligned with the Tea Party were angry, not frustrated, angry at the federal government. And I think we're seeing this coming through there. The federal response is thus. They obviously don't want an armed shootout, and it's clear the BLM and the Bundy situation is going to pull back and try to find a different route, an administrative route, some other route that doesn't involve any bloodshed. So the view is we're gonna try to tamp down this anger and not go after it right now.
Dr. Cotty, I want you to respond to a couple of comments we're getting. Day in the Sun writes, we have a conservative media lying to foment insurrection against the federal government. From Logically Speaking, they write, unfortunately, facts of history are not on the menu of the red meat, gun-toting, don't tread on me crowd. Why let truth get in the way of ratings? I'm curious, how much do you think this is media-driven? Is that a fair criticism?
I don't know how much I think is media-driven. Some of these images certainly are almost shocking, seeing ranchers versus BLM with guns. It is really disturbing knowing that this is happening on U.S. soil. I think that this is a pretty sensational story, and the fact that the media is picking it up seems pretty legitimate. To the comment about how facts are not being brought up, I think one of the facts that needs to be brought into this is that one of the arguments for state control of the lands is so that we have enough money to fund education. And to me, that seems pretty disingenuous. While Utah has had really low per pupil spending since 1987, we've actually been the lowest in the country. We had what was called Utah's funding paradox, in that while our per pupil funding was low, our effort was actually pretty high. So that if you went in and looked at how much of the state's personal income was going to education, it was actually we were one of the top in the entire country. And that peaked in the 90s when we had some changes to property taxes and the way that funds are dedicated. And now we're actually well below the national average, and we rank sort of in the mid 30s. So the fact that we're saying this is the only way we can fund education, we clearly in our past were finding other ways to fund education, and Utahns, both at the local level where we control property tax and the state level where we control higher education and public education funding, have changed those policies.
Representative Ivory, how do you...
So the fiscal analyst said that in order to close a $2.5 billion per pupil funding gap, you would have to more than double income taxes. You kill the economy to do that. You would have to increase corporate taxes by 1,000% just to close the $2.5 billion funding gap. And then our fiscal analysts tell us that 32% of our state revenue that comes from federal funds that are already going away, that the risk of that happening is very substantial. They put the risk of interest rates going to just the historic average over the next 5 years at 75%. And so, Jennifer, at just the historic average interest rate on the national debt, the federal government spends $1 trillion in interest. PILT goes away. SRS has already gone away. The other transfer fundings to the states go away. It all gets crowded out. And so in terms of a backup plan, tweaking the tax code is not going to get anywhere close to closing the gap in the dependency that we have on federal funds and the $2.5 billion education funding gap that we already have, never mind the environmental destruction that's happening all over the West on the beetle kill and the intensive fire hazard and the catastrophic wildfires that are now happening under federal management all over the West.
Jennifer, if I could just jump in there. Please. Yet in Utah, we're willing to spend $2 to $3 million to hire lobbyists to make sure that the sage grouse is not listed as an endangered species. Imagine what kind of educational programs that could buy in the 29 counties of the state of Utah. The problem really began, in my judgment, in 1980, when the tax code, which had been very progressive and maintained a balance between the least advantaged and the most advantaged in terms of their contributions on a progressive basis, were simply abolished. And we kept giving tax breaks to the wealthy to the point now, and this is an amazing thing that Forbes magazine covered last week, 65 people, just 65 people, probably 2 classrooms in Utah, control half the wealth in the world of the other half. So you have 3 billion people on one hand and 65 people on the other hand. So the fire and the devastation that Representative Ivory is talking about is because we have been starving agencies like BLM and the Forest Service and county agencies and not doing the kind of job government is supposed to do, and that is to help people get educated, make sure they have health care, and they move in a direction that supports the community rather than ripping it apart.
We only have a couple minutes left, unfortunately. A lot of questions and text I didn't get to, so I apologize. I guess I'd like to ask each of you, what do we do now? I mean, how do you sort of move forward? What are the options that you see? Pat Shea?
Instead of charging $1.35 for AUM, or Animal Unit Month, we ought to move it more towards what the state charges, which is $15 or $18 AUM, or in the private market, it ought to be $20 to $25, which it is. So I think we need to be calm. We ought not to have these kind of armed confrontations where we put people's life at risk, and we ought to go back to having civil discussions. And I hope, Mr. Ivory, that we can have a debate at the Hinckley Institute.
Representative Ivory?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. The promises at statehood are the same. The federal government made the same promise to extinguish title to the land. It said that it would pay 5% of the proceeds of the sale of public lands to the states to support the common schools. The federal government's, it's already been done in states east. So now you've got representatives all around the West in what Mr. Shea calls some rhetoric, getting together, exercising their constitutional authority and duty to be that check, that counterbalance, to restore balance in our governing system of a federal government that's simply out of balance. It's controlling more land that it was never supposed to have. It's more than $17 trillion in debt. The fires under its watch, catastrophic wildfires, are breaking records and destroying the environment, and the revenue situation, there's an urgency that's apparent. And so the path forward is education, negotiation, which is right in the bill and the legislative work that we're doing, legislation at the local, state, and national level, and litigation if necessary. Going back to his point on the sage grouse, we have throughout SITLA and our other state departments, a listing of the sage grouse would have a $40 billion negative impact on the state of Utah over a 10-year period. Imagine what that does to education in Utah.
Jennifer, I can toss in the idea of, going forward, I think we should name more people Cliven. Cliven Bundy is a really fantastic name.
It is a great name. Is legislation on the horizon? Is the Utah delegation pushing for that, Tommy?
Yeah, sure. There's always legislation like that, but the problem in Washington is nothing's getting done, especially in a midterm election like we're having this year. So Congress is not passing things through. Even if the House were to pass legislation on this, it dies in Harry Reid's Senate. So right now it's a standoff, and while everyone's happy to introduce some legislation, it isn't going anywhere.
Dr. Cotty, last word.
I think this will be really interesting to see what happens over the next few years. I started this by saying that Republican delegates feel that this is a top priority. However, Democratic delegates and voters at large, even Republican voters, don't think this is a priority. So as we've seen changes in Utah's nominating system with Count My Vote, and as we've seen actually delegates moderating over the past couple years, it will be interesting to see if this still can be an issue that people can get fired up about and really invest the time into to make the changes that would be necessary.
We'll have to leave it there, and perhaps we can continue the conversation at the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Representative Ivory, Dr. Cotty, Pat Shea, Tommy Burr, thank you all very much for the time.
Thank you.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And lots more coverage on the environment and politics at sltrib.com. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pearce. Thanks for tuning into Trib Talk today. We'll see you next time.